Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. As many of you know, we are right in the middle of Jane Austen week. This is a brand new development here at the Fox page, not really something I was intending on doing. Many of you will recall we were going to read Pride and Prejudice, and then I was going to do a quick digest of a few of the spin offs. Instead, it has morphed into this entire week because so many of these adaptations of Pride and Prejudice are so good that I feel like they each deserve their own lecture. Today, we are going to dive into Janice Hadlow's The Other Bennet Sister. So I have to say that this is the fourth iteration of Pride and Prejudice that I have read in very quick succession. So I do think that has colored quite a bit of my reading of this book. The last book that we're going to look at in Jane Austen week is Longbourn by Jo Baker. And honestly, I am saving that because it is my favorite. And it's really a case of saving best for last. I really enjoyed The Other Bennet Sister, but I found myself just doing a little bit of editing. It doesn't take a ton for me to slip into the mindset of a one-time freelance editor. But when I do, I'll notice a couple of different things. And I actually think it's often instructive to see what it is that I am thinking about in terms of editing. And honestly, with The Other Bennet Sister, a lot of it was just length. It just felt like the book was a little longer than it could have been, certainly volume one. But I also must reiterate the fact that this is the last of 4 versions of Pride and Prejudice that I read in quick succession. So I think that did really color my reading. So as always, I like to begin with this question of, why are we going to read this book? Why am I going to talk to you about this book? So obviously we are doing, this sort of delightful immersion into the world of Jane Austen and particularly into the world of Pride and Prejudice. I mentioned on Monday that I'm not actually like one of these rabid Jane Austen fans. She kind of left me cold back in the day. In fact, the entire 19th century novel, for whatever reason, it just, I liked it. I liked it fine, but it didn't really speak to me. And so I think that this most recent dive, when I have been looking at Jane Austen as satire and when I have been appreciating the historical moment a little bit better, I have gotten much more out of it, and I've really enjoyed looking at all these adaptations and what they are doing to both preserve the charm of Jane Austen and also to diverge a bit from what our Jane was doing. So I was also actually very interested in Mary. So she obviously is the unfortunate middle child, as the title suggests. We've got the older sisters, Jane and Lizzie. We've got the younger sisters, Lydia and Kitty. And then we have poor Mary in the middle. And as soon as you start thinking about Mary, which often, like, people can't remember her name, it's that kind of thing, and people can't remember the actor who played her in any one of these movie adaptations. So she is very much kind of the forgotten sister. In fact, I just was looking online and someone was like, who's the 4th Bennet sister? And I was like, oh my God, poor Mary. Like, nobody can even remember Kitty, let alone Mary, which is just honestly like kind of a tragedy. So I really was intrigued by this idea of like, what is someone going to do with Mary? And I will say that Janice Hadlow, in an interview that she did with the woman, her name is escaping me. She does that What Should I Read Next podcast, which is so great. So I believe that's where I heard this. Janice Hadlow was talking about the fact that Jane Austen provides such incredibly intriguing minor characters, and each of them has, a number of different qualities, but there'll be some sort of little kernel that she really was interested in expanding more. And I think that is a real strength of Austen. Even her, even if they feel a little type-ish, Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice is certainly a type. He's that uptight, parson guy. But she really, Janice Hadlow, in this book, in fact, really does a lot with Mr. Collins in ways that are so satisfying because they are doing that thing where she is answering questions that you didn't even know you had. So I really appreciate her approach to all of these minor characters. And certainly, on some level, Mary kind of feels like a minor character. So I was very intrigued by that idea. I also was really sold by the fact that there is a blurb at the top of this title that says, "A great achievement, Jo Baker, Longbourn." So Longbourn is the novel that we are saving for tomorrow. But I was like, wow, if Jo Baker who is just an absolutely gorgeous writer, if she is, putting her stamp of approval on the other Bennet sister, then I was ready. I was ready to dive in. Okay, quick note, no spoilers in any of the novels that we are talking about, these sort of Jane Austen derivatives, because I think there are ways that I can talk about them in a very sort of fulsome way, and I can give you all the analysis that you would want to have without, in fact, spoiling them if you have not already read them. I was intrigued to know also how popular this particular spinoff was. I saw it a ton on lots and lots of bookstore tables, and it, I think, was on a bunch of lists, and it really, there was a large publicity push surrounding it. So I was sort of unsurprised to find that a lot of people had read it. But in fact, on Goodreads, it got a 4.2 out of 5, and 20,199 people reviewed it. On Amazon, it was a 4.5 out of 5 and 7,684 people. So those are, those are ample numbers. And I was happy to know that so many people enjoyed the book, because I really did enjoy many, many aspects of it. And again, I think my quibbles come from the fact that I had read, I was a little too immersed potentially in the world of Jane Austen. For those of you who like an agenda, I'm going to go ahead and give you an agenda. Oh, but before I do, for those of you who are watching on the YouTube, you might be, this is like kind of a weird situation that I have pulled together here, but it's actually very sentimental. I really had a good time this morning, clothing myself. I was really playing Bennet sister while I was roaming around, actually in my pantry. So these two, those like neckerchief things that they tuck into their, dresses, those Regency dresses that they have. These are actually two placemats, but they belong to my granny. My granny is my paternal grandmother, who was a total Anglophile. She lived for a long time in London, by way of British Columbia. So, she was born in Pasadena and then was slowly making her way, through the Commonwealth, through Canada, and then back to the homeland. So it was very fitting, in fact, that I was using Granny's placemats for this kind of neckerchief situation. And then my shawl, which I took straight from one of the movie stills. It's actually of Mrs. Bennet, but I figure Mary, a little bit dowdy. She may have done the same thing as her mom, although we're going to talk more about Mary and her mom soon. But this is actually a little shawl that I am fairly certain that my mom knit for my daughter. So we're just doing like a whole matriarchy thing here, which I really enjoy. And, I am putting these really beautifully embroidered placemats really to some good use here. Okay, agenda. We are going to talk very briefly about Janice Hadlow's really impressive biography. Then we are going to dive in. We'll talk about the cover, the title, and the opening. We're going to look at the prose. We're then going to talk about dramatic irony, which, if you don't know what that is, it's super simple, but we're gonna dive into it a little bit. Because, in fact, dramatic irony has a huge amount to do with why we enjoy these adaptations so much. Then we're going to talk about intertexts, which is simply a fancy word for all of the different texts, all of the different books that are kind of name-checked in this book, The Other Bennet Sister. And they are not simply, in fact, name-checked. In this case, a couple of them are. But in this case, Janice Hadlow is including them because they speak volumes, no pun intended, about our Mary. We're then going to talk about the use of Pride and Prejudice. We're going to talk about the question of Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet. Those of you who have been listening to the other lectures know that I was a little bit bamboozled by the movie. I was under the impression that Mr. Bennet is in fact like kind of a fond, teasing kind of dad, when in fact it sort of seems like everybody else is reading him as like actually kind of a dick. So I was having to kind of recalibrate my thinking there a little bit. And in fact, Janice Hadlow is, again, going to come down on the side of Mr. Bennet and, in fact, Mrs. Bennet as, like, really not being great people, which I will say it again, not quite as much fun. It's a little bit more fun when we are reading Pride and Prejudice as much more comedic and much more light. And I actually could argue, if I were going to like really dig into this whole thing, that the satire in Pride and Prejudice is such that we can read, in fact, Mr. Bennet with some levity. So back to the agenda. We're going to talk about Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Then we're going to talk at the very end about these kind of larger questions of what Janice Hadlow is doing with plot. Again, no spoilers, but I'm going to give you a sense of really just like of sort of the larger scope and some of the bigger questions that she is addressing. So, quick biography of the very impressive Janice Hadlow. She was born in 1957. She worked at the BBC forever. She like did all of the like big thinking and like big decisions at BBC Two and BBC Four. I think she might not really enjoy my description of her having done all the big decisions at BBC. I sound like I don't understand how the professional world works at all, which is actually kind of true. But she was a very, very big deal at the BBC. She apparently ran two and four, which I guess those are channels, maybe. So she worked at the BBC for a long time, and then in 2014 published a book called A Royal Experiment: The Private Life of King George III. So it's actually very important to keep in mind that she is essentially someone who is really steeped in history. She's married to a guy named Martin, maybe Martin Hadlow, I don't know, Martin somebody or other, who also is at the BBC, but who does like the history department at the BBC. Now I'm speaking like they're academics, but that is in fact a world I know a little better. He is very interested in history, and it sounds like she is as well, because she wrote, in fact, a biography of King George III. So some of you may know King George III, in fact, from Hamilton, who honestly, I felt like that guy kind of stole the show in just an absolutely absurd and hilarious way. So King George III was born in 1760 and died in 1820. The reason why I mention that is because King George, is the one who had the son who became George IV. But importantly, when King George was deemed, crazy by the royals, his son was made Prince Regent. And that is why we call this period the Regency. I don't know if a royal experiment has to do with the idea of this regency, and I actually don't know how often a Prince Regent was ruling instead of a king in British history. But in fact, that was the case during the Regency. And this Regency period is important because, of course, this is when Jane Austen has set all of her works. And again, it's important to remember she was working on Pride and Prejudice from 1796 until 1813. This is approximate. I imagine we know that from drafts and whatnot, but again, I am not a student of the history, and I am also not a student of Jane Austen's life. But we do know that she published it in 1813. She had all of those big books come out, and there's 6 novels, I believe, and they came out, in between 1810 and I guess 1816 or something like that. I mean, again, don't quote me on all of this, but I'm giving you, I'm grounding you essentially in the gist of the whole thing. This was a time when England was at war because this is when the Napoleonic Wars are going on. So the history is very important. And in fact, Janice Hadlow was a real student of it, enough that she wrote this book about King George. I really enjoyed the fact I was looking up King George's dates to make sure that he was, in fact, corresponding correctly. There are a lot of Georges. This is the Georgian era, and I wanted to make sure I had the correct George that she was talking about. And it was popped up on Google, one of those like pops up the question and then the answer is highlighted. And it said, what was George III famous for? And underneath it said, losing the American colonies and going mad. So, in fact, again, if you think about Hamilton, if you were lucky enough to see that, you in fact know that he was the one who lost the American colonies and then went mad. So, but again, the important note here is the fact that Janice Hadlow is a historian and was really steeped in the era. And you see that throughout the other Bennet sister. It's really ample in terms of its use of history and certainly its use of historians throughout. So, the other Bennet sister came out came out in 2020, and Janice Hadlow lives in Edinburgh. She also has 2 sons. Okay, now we are going to go ahead and dive on into the book itself. I love the cover. You all know that I am a real sucker for a cover, and this one did not disappoint. I find it so intriguing and so appealing. There are actually a number of different versions, and I like all of them. They're sort of different iterations of this same sort of thing. So I like the fact, it interests me that we have chopped off the top of this woman's head. I know there's a lot of politics of showing bodies and then having parts of them cut off. I don't actually know all of the sort of, cultural criticism around this idea, but I do know, in fact, it seems a little bit odd that we are chopping off Mary's head. Presumably this is Mary, which it's important just even to note that we have the one woman on the front of the cover, girl, here. It's a little hard to tell how old she is, but like not that old. I'm really enjoying the way that her outfit is coordinating with my outfit. I was thinking to myself, I was really fixated on this cover when I was doing my lecture prep. I was thinking how funny it would be if we only had like her eyes, like if we only had her forehead and her eyes, because Mary is someone who's very cerebral. She's very in her head and not so much in her body. So I think this in some ways is counterintuitive because in fact we should have more of Mary's head and less of her body in some ways. But again, it would make for kind of a ridiculous look if we only had the top, of her eyes and her forehead. But here we have who we assume is Mary, but we have her eyes chopped off, which is interesting because in this book, Janice Hadlow, in fact, makes much of her eyes. And she, in fact, has glasses, and that becomes a plot point. And the whole idea of her seeing things clearly becomes sort of metaphorical in the sense that she is increasingly, seeing herself and seeing those around her more clearly as her eyes are being adjusted and as she is, delving more authentically and more deeply into her love of history and philosophy. I also really like the choice to make the other essentially go away. Like what you see when you look at this cover is Bennet's sister, Janice Hadlow. I keep saying Harlow. Pardon me, Janice. So when we see Bennet's sister and Janice Hadlow, that is what jumps out at us. And in fact, the other is very subtly diminished because in fact, the other Bennet's sister, the fact that she is the other is really, it really is underscoring how she is so much kind of forgotten. So I really enjoy everything about this. I like the font. I like the palette. It's really just beautiful. I do like how this red cushion down here is also picking up a bit of the color of the top. But it's not even the same hue, which is good because it would be too matchy. But it also is underscoring the subtlety of this even compared to the image below. The title itself is great also. I just really like the fact, part of this kind of industry of these novels that people write is in fact leaning into this idea of the Bennets and the fact that the Bennet, Lydia Bennet witch, or calling a book Longbourn, which is the case of the other two spin-offs that we're looking at. They really are, leading with something that is very evocative of Pride and Prejudice, which is really good. I think it's very important to signal to your reader as they are browsing bookstore tables that this is going to, in fact, offer them more of their beloved Pride and Prejudice. But again, I like the idea here of, she's the other Bennet sister, the totally forgettable one. There's nothing here about Mary. There's another book that's called Mary B, which I don't know anything about. But even in that case, the Mary is very small and the B is very large. So that's a little bit more subtle. That's a little bit deeper cut for all of the Austen lovers out there. I'll throw up a picture of it on the YouTube. But we have this idea of really, you should lean into the Bennet angle or the Longbourn angle or the Darcy angle, frankly, because those are so readily recognized by readers. But I really like this. It also is putting emphasis on the sisters, the fact that she is one of the sisters, and that sort of evokes, as opposed to Mrs. Darcy or whatever, it really evokes the idea of the five of them as a unit who are really different people, but are, their fates are all sort of the same in the sense that they either have to make a marriage or they're going to be in real trouble in terms of their financial independence and their security in their home. So I think it's really a very excellent title. Now we're going to dive in finally to the book. We have a bunch of blurbs, and then it is important that also by Janice Hadlow, we have here, in fact, A Royal Experiment, Love and Duty, Madness and Betrayal, The Private Lives of King George III and Queen Charlotte. This is the longer version. This is the proper version of her book. I like this longer version of the title, and I like sort of this acknowledgement of the fact that this is the private lives of very public figures. And I think, what Hadlow is doing here with the other Bennet sister is doing somewhat the same thing. She's showing us, in fact, the private life of Mary Bennet, which is someone who is relatively enigmatic in much the way that we know, bits and pieces about King George III. In fact, mostly we know he lost the colonies and that he went mad. But looking at his private life would be interesting in the same way that looking at the private life of Mary Bennet is also interesting. We have a dedication. For Martin, Alexander, and Louis, my three bright shining stars. My three bright shining stars is very sweet. I'm going to leave it at that. Martin is her husband. Alexander and Louis, I'm assuming those are her two children. We know from Wikipedia, you and I, that in fact she has two children. I'm assuming these are her two sons. We're now going to dive into the text itself. I will remind you, listeners, yet again, that it is a really good idea to really slow down and pay attention to the opening of a book. Often it will provide keys as to how you might focus your attention, what sort of narrator, for example. There are all sorts of different pieces that you can gain in the very beginning that will, in fact, I think, enrich the rest of your experience with the book. So we're going to dive into chapter 1. These are some of my ugliest readers, which seemed really appropriate because remember poor Mary has those ugly glasses in the beginning. I mean, let's hear it for glasses, but also maybe not her, wasn't easy to be a glasses wearer back then. Okay, we're at the very beginning of the book. It is a sad fact of life that if a young woman is unlucky enough to come into the world without expectations, she had better do all she can to ensure she is born beautiful. To be poor and handsome is misfortune enough, but to be penniless and plain is a hard fate indeed. So a couple of quick thoughts. One is that we have this omniscient narrator, very much like the omniscient third-person narrator that we see in Pride and Prejudice. And here, this narrator is stating this fact. It is a third-person omniscient narrator, and the camera is pulled way, way back in the sense that we're having this grand pronouncement made about, what is happening here. It's a little closer. It's not this, it is a truth, universally acknowledged, and, it's not sort of purporting to give us this, universal truth, but it is, in fact, giving us what we are supposed to read as kind of a truth about young women and their prospects. It's also interesting to me that we are talking here about expectations. If a woman is unlucky enough to come into the world without expectations, she had better do all she can to ensure she is born beautiful. So there are a couple of different things actually that are interesting here. One is this idea of expectations. This is not the same as, Pride and Prejudice, where the focus is really on money and marriage and the idea of settling yourself and sort of having security through your nuptials. Here, in fact, we are talking about expectations, which is much more personal and has much more to do with your own self-satisfaction. We also are talking about this idea of a young woman better ensure she is beautiful, which gives some agency to the girl, to the young woman. This idea that she has the power to be beautiful or not to be beautiful. And that is actually, it sounded like I was going to say, and that is the question. To be beautiful or not to be beautiful, that is the question. So, but here we have this idea of, that a young woman has agency. And to a certain degree, one of the questions of this novel is can Mary see herself as beautiful? Does she have, in fact, the power, even though she is, quote unquote, plain, to the point where she's looking at herself in the mirror and just really despairing. But in fact, this idea of where does beauty come from? I mean, there are lots of answers to that question, but this question of can Mary essentially become beautiful by in fact believing she is beautiful? So there's some distinctions here at the beginning that I really like, but again, this is doing the same thing that many of these spin-offs are, which is that we are very well grounded in the language of Jane Austen. The tone is much the same, the verbiage is much the same, the narrator is much the same. All of that is very satisfying, but again, we have these small departures. We're going to look at the next paragraph. 4 of the 5 Bennet sisters of Meryton in Hertfordshire had sensibly provided themselves with good looks enough to be accounted beauties in the limited circles in which they moved. Jane, the eldest, was the most striking, the charms of her face and figure enhanced by the unassuming modesty of her character. Elizabeth, the second sister, made up in wit and liveliness for any small deficiencies in her appearance, whilst Catherine and Lydia, the 2 youngest, exhibited all the freshness of youth, accompanied by a taste for laughter and flirtation, which recommended them greatly to young men of equally loud and undiscriminating inclinations. Only Mary, the middle daughter, possessed neither beauty, wit, nor charm. But her sisters shone so brightly that they seemed to cancel out her failure, and, indeed, eclipse her presence altogether, so that by the time they were grown, the Bennet family was regarded as one of the most pleasing in the neighborhood. as I just mentioned, the beginning of any work of fiction, if the author is worth her salt, is going to really set a precedent. And one thing I will say here, I could have used this just tightened up just a teeny bit. So again, if you were dipping into this in and amongst a bunch of other books, it would be really delightful, in fact, to sort of sink back into this world of Jane Austen. Because I was really already sunk into the world, this felt a little bit more reiterative than I needed it to be. And in fact, I found quite a bit of volume one feeling a bit like that. We would have familiar scenes and familiar interactions, which is always fun. You know, it's always fun to be like, oh gosh, okay, what is Hadlow going to do with this familiar moment? But and lots of that was very gratifying. But I felt like once we got to volume two, things really took off because, in fact, we were moving into territory that was unknown to us in the scope of Pride and Prejudice. And so Hadlow was really sort of developing her own world and treating us to all sorts of new things. So I really love the prose. I love the way that she is mimicking a lot of Jane Austen's language. I really think it's very solid. It's very kind of effortless. We feel like we are in that world of Jane Austen. And honestly, there is not a false note. I mean, she really does hit all of these things. My little list of anachronisms in the back, 0. I didn't really find anything. There was one thing, one kind of like turn of phrase where I was like, I guess maybe they said that back then, but it seemed like a little bit modern. But literally there was like one time and I didn't even note it. So I really, really loved the prose throughout. Now that we've looked at the prose sort of in general terms by taking a look at those first paragraphs, we're going to talk a little bit about this notion of dramatic irony. So all of these books really hinge in some ways on this concept of dramatic irony. This is a very simple concept, essentially. It's kind of a fancy word for it. But I like these terms because they allow us to understand a function that's kind of intuitive, but once you have a name for it and once you've discussed it, you really understand part of the reason why these books are so delightful. Dramatic irony simply means that the reader has information that the other characters in the book do not have. So this would have come from classic drama in the sense of like Euripides and, Aeschylus, like all of those kind of, big dramatists of the classical age. But, oh my God, there's a dog. Here comes a dog. Oh boy. Okay. Oh my God, it's the really old dog. Oh. So in that era, you would have, as theater goers, you would have had information because of something that happened on the set, and then those people would leave, and someone else would come out, and you have information that these new players, in fact, do not have. So in a novel, it works the exact same way. You learn something from some characters, and then they exit stage left, and then someone else is on the stage, metaphorically, and you have knowledge and those people do not have the knowledge. And it's so basic, but also so delightful because there's a tension. There's an automatic tension because if it's used well, it's a situation where like they should know the information and they in fact do not have it. So part of the reason why it's built in to all of these, iterations of Pride and Prejudice are because the reader knows the story. We know the sort of broad outlines. We know Charlotte is going to end up with Mr. Collins, and we know that Lydia is going to run off with Wickham, and we know in fact that Jane is going to end up with Mr. Bingley. So we know these things, and so when someone is coming along and rewriting them, we have this idea of like, oh my gosh, wait, is the same thing going to happen again? Is Jane going to end up with Mr. Bingley? Or if she already has, we have this entire backstory. So if some sort of subplot is occurring, we can bring all that Pride and Prejudice gave us to bear on this new situation. So for whatever reason, in the other Bennet sister, because I think the first volume is a lot of reiteration of scenes that we know well from Pride and Prejudice, I had more of a sense of dramatic irony being really key. Interestingly, it's not until we get to page 70 of this book that we are essentially at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice. This is when Mrs. Bennet is excited because Netherfield has been let at last. When Mrs. Bennet is talking to Mr. Bennet, she says, "Will it make you happy to see Charlotte Lucas established at Netherfield? Every moment you delay might be of consequence." So that's a big moment of dramatic irony because, in fact, Charlotte Lucas does not take over Netherfield. Netherfield? Yes, Netherfield. She does not, in fact, become, the matroness of Netherfield, she in fact becomes established at Longbourn. So that's an even more sort of piquant example of like us being like, oh my God, wait, she's not going to be, Charlotte's not the one over at Netherfield. In fact, Charlotte is coming for you and your house, Mrs. Bennet. So you have this kind of delicious sense of like, wait, I know what's going to happen, and these people don't know what's going to happen yet. So there's this real sense throughout the entire novel. It's really sort of one of the foundations of why these iterations are so delightful. We have another example on page 138. This is right after Mr. Collins has proposed to Lizzie and she has in fact refused him. Charlotte speaks first. I think you are safe enough, but it is clear he does still hope to discover some fortunate woman to preside over his parsonage. Well, whoever she is, she must form her own conclusions as to the desirability of an offer from Mr. Collins, Lizzie said with a laugh, her good humor quite restored. I am only relieved to be free of him myself. The interesting thing here, of course, is that Lizzie is talking to Charlotte and is like, I'm just glad I'm not marrying Mr. Collins, but like someone else is going to have to decide if they want to do that. And here we, in fact, as readers know that Charlotte is the one who is going to do that. We don't know exactly how it's going to go down. One of the truly delightful things in the Scandalous Confessions of Lydia Bennet, which is this whole scene that explains, in fact, how Charlotte and Mr. Collins got together. But in this case, it's enough to have us think like, oh my gosh, wait, they're the ones who are going to get together. It's such a delightful thing when we have this information and in fact no one else does yet. So, and then down at the bottom of the page, we have a reminder, in fact, that Mary has sort of, set her sights on Mr. Collins. And I mean, honestly, poor Mary, just like the whole first volume. In fact, there was another critic who was talking about how it was in fact very hard to read the first volume in many ways. And it was like poor Mary at every turn is just getting, sort of trod upon, which is just, it's just a little bit brutal sometimes. So in fact, at the bottom, it says this. Once Lizzie had gone, Mary watched as Mr. Collins offered Charlotte his arm. Charlotte graciously accepted, and at a steady, unhurried pace, they made their way into the beech grove until they were quite out of Mary's sight. So it's very sad, and it's very significant that this is happening at the end of a chapter. It's sort of, it really portends a lot. But also, as readers, we know, in fact, what is going to happen. So poor Mary is suffering here, and we know that she is, in fact, right to suffer. I also love how beautifully kind of figurative that language is. The idea of the two of them walking out of Mary's sight. Again, Mary's sight is a very big deal throughout this entire book. The fact that she can't see things clearly, the fact that, the guy who makes her glasses is somewhat of a love interest because, in fact, he is giving her sight. There are lots of different ways, and she has different glasses as we go through the novel. So this idea of her sight is very important. I keep making eyes. I'm doing like a little glasses thing with my hands here. But this idea of ending the chapter with the idea of them moving out of her sight is both like a nice, underscoring of the importance of her sight, which is a motif through the novel, but it's also some foreshadowing. We know, in fact, that they will be moving out of her sight because they will be, in fact, marrying and leaving poor Mary to herself. Interesting. Just occurred to me that Mary, like this idea of like you have to marry, is particularly ironic in the case of Mary because everyone else is getting married, and in fact she is the only one who is not married. So we are going to move on. So dramatic irony is just that fancy word for knowing information that the characters in the book don't know. Intertexts is just a fancy word for all of the different texts that come up in the novel. And in this case, it's very important because, in fact, Mary is so bookish. And so much of her life and her joy comes, in fact, from reading. So we really do want to know what it is she's reading and what she's not reading. So we know from the very beginning that she's reading someone named Mrs. Macaulay. And that is a woman who was a historian in the middle of the 18th century, so 1700s. She wrote this big history of, I think it was in England, history of England. It had to do with like William the Conqueror coming over like that. I think that was 1066 maybe. Is that Battle of Hastings? Wow. I don't know where this information is coming from deep in like ninth grade history or something. But this idea of English history was very important to her. She was not interested in suffrage or women's rights. She was just very much interested in history itself. So from 1763 to 1783, she was writing this big history of England. So she is a very important person because we have this kind of liberated young woman. And that, in fact, provides one of the big questions that runs through the novel, which is like, is our Mary going to, in fact, become an independent woman, or is Mary going to marry? So it turns out that Mrs. Macaulay, she married someone who was much, much younger. I don't have all of the insights, but she was much older and this guy was much younger. And I think they went to the colonies. I think they went to the United States because it was so scandalous. I think he was like not only younger, but also like, of lower social standing. So she, in fact, was married. She was not an independent woman. And in fact, her marriage like spelled, disaster for her social standing. And she had to sort of flee England. Again, I'm giving you kind of loose history here. So we have Mrs. Macaulay and her history of England, which is important. And then we have Dr. Fordyce. So we know this Dr. Fordyce is in fact present in Pride and Prejudice because that is the book that Mr. Collins reads to all the young women, and they are so bored. Like, it's just like torture for all of them, for everyone in the Bennet family. But someone who we don't really hear much about in Pride and Prejudice, in fact, is apparently really enjoying that back in the Jane Austen novel. Because, at least for Janice Hadlow, because Janice Hadlow is going to make Mary, in fact, into a real fan of this Dr. Fordyce. So Dr. Fordyce gave credit to women for like having a brain and stuff, but was very moralistic and very prescribed about what they could and could not do. And any sort of, attention to beauty or any sort of sartorial kind of frippery, any of that stuff was really looked down upon by him. So he would have been like, really leading women to sort of decide that they have to either be intellectual and involved in life of the mind, or, just like absolutely trivial and frivolous and all the rest of it. So, kind of a polarizing figure, but both Mr. Collins and Mary are in fact big fans of Dr. Fordyce. We also have Aristotle. We have a bunch of other people who, Aristotle being kind of the most prominent one. In fact, for Mary and Mr. Collins both, the Greek philosophers and the Greek language, in fact, and Aristotle are all really important thinkers. And it's a very important piece of Mary's evolution because we have this sense of like, is she going to become some kind of like blue stocking, and like really become a woman of letters, which would have probably been, deeply embarrassing for her mother? Or is she, in fact, going to find love? So again, a lot of these intertexts and a lot of her interaction with literature or philosophy or history is underscoring and sort of like bringing to the surface this question of like, is she going to be an intellect and is that going to sort of sink her socially, or in fact is she going to marry and is this sort of a comedy that is going to end with her being happily married? A comedy in the classical sense. So a comedy, in the Greek period or in Shakespeare even would end in a marriage. That's sort of like that's like the definition of comedy. One thing that Mary is not reading, and in fact that we know that she does not particularly care for, are novels. So at one point, Lizzie is reading a novel by Fanny Burney. It's Evelina, which I do not know these. I'm assuming that these are very close to Pamela. So they're the same era as Pamela. Evelina was written, again, by Fanny Burney. It was published in 1778. She wrote another one called Cecilia in 1782. Cecilia is a title that I have heard of. And even Lizzie, when Lizzie is reading these, 2 decades after they came out, because this is all happening at the very beginning of the 19th century, she in fact is already laughing at them. It's important to remember that Jane Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice as essentially a satire that was really making fun and sort of spoofing these sentimental novels of the 18th century, of the 1700s. So you have this idea of these novels as being something that Mary, in fact, does not care for, which is important because these novels are very much about, women falling in love and being sentimental and having lots and lots of emotion and being sort of not in charge of their emotions, and of course being very invested in the idea of romance and these very sort of sentimental, like high-blown romances. So if Jane Austen is writing a satire, then we have Mary falling into line essentially with Jane and being like, no thank you with the sentimental novels. I'm going to actually focus on history and philosophy. So we really have this idea of Mary as sort of embracing this world that is fairly opposed to marriage. we're going to move on and talk about the way that Janice Hadlow uses Pride and Prejudice, certainly in the very first volume of her novel. There were lots of times where the conversation felt so close to what Jane Austen had written that I was like, is this verbatim? And then I was like, wait, can you do that? Like, can you just like pull Jane Austen? And I think because it's so old, I mean, honestly, whatever, I think after 100 years, I mean, I am not a legal, scholar here, and I don't really know exactly what I'm talking about, but my sense is that, you can start making copies of it and you can use it. And also, of course, because it is very plain that these books are based on Jane Austen, I imagine they're, legally you can use quite a bit. The idea of just like lifting entire passages, first of all, seems not very ethical. Also, just like not that interesting. But I will say that it was close enough. In fact, at one point I was walking my dogs, or else I would have dashed over and gotten Pride and Prejudice. But I was listening to the audio version, and I was like, wait, this just feels like, honestly, she just pulled this right from the book. So I do want to read the two side by side so we can have a sense of really like how close it is. So here is the Austen. This is when Mr. Bennet and Mr. Collins, they're talking about Lady de Burgh and Lady Catherine de Burgh and his, his patroness. And Mr. Bennet speaks first. It is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment or are the result of previous study? They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible. And then we see something very, very close in the other Bennet sister. About 100 pages into the novel, we essentially have a reiteration of almost this exact same scene. So Mr. Bennet says this. It is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are they the result of previous study? They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, replied Mr. Collins, and though I sometimes amuse myself with composing such elegant little compliments as may be adapted to any occasion, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible. So, I mean, really, it's like a big chunk that is taken verbatim. So, and again, like if you had not been quite as immersed as I was, that may just feel familiar in kind of a delightful way, and may not, in fact, seem like where you're like, wait, is it legal to be, lifting whole passages? So that sounds a bit more critical than I mean it to be, because it's an interesting question, and so much of all of these books is so heavily resting on Jane Austen that you can see where if you like, why would you sort of try to, like change that in slight ways so that it looks like you're not, in fact, plagiarizing? It's not plagiarizing because, in fact, you are telling your source. What's interesting to me, though, is that we then have some reflections on this scene later in The Other Bennet Sister in a way that really reveals a lot about Mr. Collins. Interestingly, it's exactly 100 pages later, on page 198. So this is when he is talking to Mary. I really enjoyed this part. So Mr. Collins and Mary have reason to get close to one another, and it's a very nice part of the book until it's not. Okay, so, but he is saying to Mary, by way of sort of explaining himself, I have always known I did not possess a talent for making friends. My father, was a bitter and disappointed man. There were many things that made him angry, but chief among them, I fear, was myself. He made it plain enough that I was the worst of the many vicissitudes that life had inflicted on him. He told me often enough I was worthless, and I soon learnt to take myself at his valuation. Then he died, and I thought it within my power to change my life forever. So I really like this. Again, we have this kind of, verbatim situation earlier where we see Mr. Collins as this kind of absurd character that people are poking fun at. But then later we realize, in fact, that we should have a lot of sympathy for him. And that is not something that is super clear in Austen. Mr. Collins is not someone who elicits a lot of sympathy in Pride and Prejudice, but here, in fact, he does. And then down a little further, we have an even more pointed reference to the conversation with Mr. Bennet. Do you remember your father asking me once at dinner if I made up in advance the compliments I then thought were so pleasing to ladies? I was such a fool that I told him the truth. Of course I did. How else would they occur to a man such as myself? So I thought this was so genius. I mean, Janice Hadlow here is taking something that is very familiar and really taking, I mean, who essentially like this absurd hackney, this absurd sort of type person, this person who's just nothing but this like oaf-ish character throughout all of Pride and Prejudice, and in fact is giving him a backstory very economically, very quickly, and very compellingly, I think, in much the telling style of Jane Austen that we see in Pride and Prejudice, and then, really hearkening back to this time when he looked particularly ridiculous, but in fact really telling us that he is way more self-aware than at first blush. I just loved this. I thought it was really one of the strengths throughout this novel that Janice Hadlow will take a minor character and in fact will flesh that person out in a way that is really satisfying and really adds to our appreciation of Pride and Prejudice. It's so well done. So earlier on in The Other Bennet Sister, I realized that we were going to revisit some of these very familiar scenes, and in fact that some of them would be verbatim. And I was like, oh gosh, I wonder if we're going to get that passage of Mary talking about pride. Because honestly, like Mary does not get a lot of airtime in Pride and Prejudice. And I really have a lot of respect for how Janice Hadlow is very faithful to the times when we do see Mary, and she includes a lot of them and adds her own nuance. So I was very interested to see if we were going to see this part about pride. And in fact, this is the version that is in Pride and Prejudice. So this is when the people are talking about how Mr. Darcy is so proud. And Mary says the following. Pride, observed Mary, who piqued herself upon the solidity of her reflections, is a very common failing, I believe. By all that I have ever read, I am convinced that it is very common indeed, that human nature is particularly prone to it, and that there are very few of us who do not cherish a feeling of self-complacency on the score of some quality or other, real or imaginary. Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us. And then in The Other Bennet Sister, and we have Mary say this. I wonder if we are quite fair to condemn Mr. Darcy as quickly as we do. There is a difference, between pride and vanity. One is much more to be condemned than the other. The vain man wants others to think well of himself regardless of his virtues. Pride relates more to our honest opinion of ourselves. So here we have slight variations, in fact, in what Mary is saying in the second novel by Janice Hadlow. So we do have a slight variation there, but it's very, very close, in fact, and it's very satisfying because she's taking this piece of Mary that we know well from Pride and Prejudice, one of the few times where we hear a whole big chunk of language from Mary, and she's putting her own sort of spin on it in The Other Bennet Sister. It's really well done. We are going to close today with just two quick reflections. One on Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, the age-old question that I continually wrestle with as to whether or not he's like this cruel ass or whether he in fact is like a fond, doting father who just likes to tease a lot. So most people seem to fall on the former. And so I'm having to sort of shift more and more toward that because in fact these people are real scholars and have spent lots and lots of time thinking about this question. Again, I'm going to blame it on the movie. What was interesting for me here in this book is how really awful Mrs. Bennet is. So I think in Pride and Prejudice, she is pretty awful, but she also is not like toxic. So there was one review that I read that talked about how Mary really needed to extricate herself from this toxic family environment. And part of me was like, yes, like Mary should extricate herself, but like, is it super toxic? I mean, I guess it's fairly toxic, but like, I think it was also very much a product of its times. And the fact that Mrs. Bennet has these 5 daughters who really need to be secured and need to have their futures established for themselves. So you think of Mrs. Bennet, at least I do, in Pride and Prejudice, as certainly being frivolous and perhaps an inflated sense of her daughters. And she certainly is not subtle in any sort of social circles. She's very embarrassing for Lizzie and she's very embarrassing for Jane. And in fact, she's very gauche in lots of ways, but she's not necessarily as cruel as she comes across in The Other Bennet Sister. In The Other Bennet Sister, she's just awful. She's mean to Mary all the time and says really cutting things. And so for me, it was a little tricky because I was used to thinking of her as being kind of frivolous and sort of trivial and certainly like goofy and absurd, but like not really cruel. And Janice Hadlow is really leaning into that. part of it, in my opinion, might have just been this plot point, because in fact, if Mrs. Bennet were not super terrible, then Mary, after spoiler, tiny spoiler, Mr. Bennet in fact does die at some point in the other Bennet sister. It's not a huge plot point, but it is in the sense that Mary Bennet cannot go on living with her parents, which actually I feel like she would have been very happy if someone had sort of left her to her library and her piano. She, in fact, could have felt relatively happy. But one of the plot points is like, where is she going to land? Who is she going to end up with? Is she going to live with one of her sisters? Is she going to find employment? Is she going to marry? So this big question really wouldn't be able to exist if, in fact, her mother were an option. Like, if she could just go and live with Mrs. Bennet and they could sort of be happily, spinstering together, terrible word, but like if they could be independent women together living, in whatever, means they could, then essentially we don't have a plot. So I think part of what Hadlow is doing is having to exaggerate a bit the cruelty of Mrs. Bennet in order to sort of push Mary out of the nest. Another question of mine goes back to that idea of, I believe it's Mr. Carpenter who wrote the introduction to my version, my edition of Pride and Prejudice. And in it, he says that the tricky thing about satire is that if it is misread, then your writing ends up essentially just being cruel. And I really enjoyed Pride and Prejudice this time through because I really was looking at it as a comedy, as something that was meant to be really, a spoof and a send-up. And so this idea of there being a certain amount of levity, which I really saw and which we looked at fairly closely on Monday, that book is really funny. Pride and Prejudice is very light in lots of ways. And this book instead, the other Bennet sister, is not particularly light. And part of the levity in Pride and Prejudice, in fact, really derives from Mrs. Bennet because she's such a ridiculous character. So if you make her a cruel character, which she very much is in the other Bennet sister, we lose some of the levity of Pride and Prejudice, and we wonder if in fact Hadlow is maybe pushing the reader toward an interpretation that's a little bit too literal of what Jane Austen is writing in Pride and Prejudice, if we are not keeping in mind quite so much that we are meant to read this as satire, and that a lot of what she is doing is meaning to be ironic and somewhat sort of funny, and with a decent amount of levity, when in fact it seems like Janice Hadlow is reading a lot of it simply as truth. Also, of course, then we have Mary as honestly like being a little more of a downer. So in some ways, Mary is kind of a ridiculous character in Pride and Prejudice, and she's sort of a foil for the sisters. She's much more serious, and she's, living this life of the mind, and she's always practicing the piano, and she's, seems very intelligent and has these thoughts on vanity and pride. So we have her as again, somewhat of a foil for the other sisters, who are all much more frivolous and much more interested in boys and ribbons and whatnot. But if we read Jane Austen literally, then Mary also becomes, just like more of a downer. In that first volume of The Other Bennet Sister, lacking some of the levity of Jane Austen means that Mary feels heavier and Mrs. Bennet feels heavier. So I was a little bit frustrated at times with Mary because I just was like, oh gosh, this is slightly unrelenting, the way that people are being mean to her and the way that she is internalizing their thoughts about her. So the last thing I want to discuss is this larger question. So the big kind of question here is like, what is going to happen to Mary? Is Mary going to be an independent woman who has her life of the mind and her piano and has some person or not, who is sort of her equal and her partner and someone who brings her joy because they share the same thing? We do have this question of like, is it an ugly duckling story? We have Lydia Bennet, who's already the black sheep of the family. So then there is this question, like, is it an ugly duckling thing where she's like kind of awkward as a youth and like into her books and whatnot? And then there's going to be some terrible transformation where she ends up, in fact, being beautiful and like putting away the books and like becoming appealing to men. Happily, as you can imagine, in 2020, that's not the direction that Hadlow took. I don't think that is a spoiler, but it is interesting because part of that question of like the ugly duckling and becoming appealing to men is going to end up with marriage. So one of the questions is like, is Mary, I was so interested in this question of like, is Hadlow going to deliver us an independent woman? Like, is one of these women going to be independent and, not marry and not need a man in order to be happy? Or is in fact she going to marry and find someone who either makes her miserable or who makes her happy? So those bigger plot questions became really important because we know the fates of all the other sisters, and we know, a couple of the directions that Mary could go. Obviously, Mary is very confined by the time. So, she can't work. She can't make her own money. She can't all of a sudden have an inheritance. So she needs to figure out where she fits in this puzzle. But, she has 4 married sisters and a mother and aunts. She's got Mrs. Phillips and she has Mrs. Gardner. So she has lots of family, and Charlotte Lucas. A lot of people could sort of take her in and she could become this independent woman, whatever that would mean. Or she's going to marry. So I'm going to leave it to you to find out what, in fact, Janice Hadlow has to say about Mary, and whether or not Mary is going to find independence, whether she's going to find marriage, whether she finds misery or happiness in that marriage. I'm going to leave it up to you. But I'm going to let you know that I thought it was fine. I thought it was good. Solid. Okay. On that note, kind of prosaic, not really all that inspired, I will leave it there. I'm very excited to talk about Longbourn tomorrow. Thank you very much for tuning into all of this Jane Austen week, if you have. And if you've only listened to this one lecture, then that's great too. If you only wanted to just have like a little snippet of Jane Austen week, absolutely great. But I hope you head back to the Foxed page and find something else to listen to. Happy reading.